A Dragonback series by Timothy Zahn. Book 3, Dragon and Slave. Chapter 15. The night turned out to be a lot longer than he'd expected. Earlier, he'd been surprised that the whole Chakuk family seemed to have dropped in for dinner. Now, with Uncle Verge's running translation, he was able to catch enough bits and pieces of conversation to figure out what was actually going on. It was, it seemed, her Thumbleness's high day. He never did nail down whether it was her birthday or some other kind of anniversary, or even just the day they all celebrated her favorite color. Whatever it was, though, it was a big deal around the Chakuk household, and her Thumbleness was playing it for all it was worth. After dinner came a huge dessert that looked like a sentence of death by chocolate and ground-up tree bark. Apparently, the idea was to make as much of a mess as possible while eating it. Her Thumbleness and her friends did that part very well. After that came game time, with the chocolate-smeared children and a few of the adults gathering in an underground room about the size of a regulation basketball court. The games generated nearly as much noise as the whole crowd upstairs had been able to produce, with the added feature of bone-crunching thuds and wallops as the kids ran into each other. They played a number of different games, with a whole range of different types of balls. The nearest Jack got to figuring out the rules to any of them was that whenever one Brumga had a chance to run into another one, he did so. That, and whenever her Thumbleness came to the sidelines for a break, her new court jester had better have a trick or something ready to amuse her. Under the circumstances, it was impossible for him to slip away to go computer hunting. Standing at the sidelines, listening to a couple of the adults breathing loudly behind him, he wondered if the party girl was ever going to run out of steam. He thought that moment had finally come when the children dropped their balls and discs and toss bladders in the middle of the court and all came jogging back to the sidelines. But no such luck. After the games, apparently, her Thumbleness had scheduled a sleepover with several of her closer friends. They headed upstairs again, jabbering away in a dozen different conversations. Jack trudged along behind them, bone-tired, but trying hard not to show it. If her Thumbleness's new toy didn't work the way she wanted it to, she would almost certainly send it back, and he couldn't afford that. Besides, even a Brumgan kid on a massive sugar high couldn't keep up this pace forever. Eventually, she and her friends would have to give up on the fun and frolic and get some sleep. Eventually they did, winding down their chattering and board comp games and collapsing one by one onto the heavy mats that had been set up for them in her Thumbleness's bedroom suite. But by the time the girl dismissed Jack with a lazy wave of her hand, the sky to the east was starting to glow red. The rest of the slave staff was already hard at work downstairs cooking breakfast and preparing the house for their master's day. And it wasn't just the slaves who were on the move either. Some of the Brumgas and their staff were stirring as well. Even as Jack headed along the side of the large entryway toward the stairs to the slave quarters, he caught a glimpse of Gazin going into an office on the far side of the chamber. Luckily, Gazin didn't see him, but any hopes Jack might have had of trying to get to the computers ended right there. Wandering slaves he might be willing to risk. A wandering Gazin he wasn't. Well, that was fun, he commented tiredly as he closed the door to his tiny room and dropped onto the bed. Wasn't that fun, everybody? What exactly are you doing? Dracos asked. Yeah, lad, what exactly are you doing? Uncle Verge demanded. Some kind of marathon magic show? Pretty close, Jack admitted, wincing as he bent his left leg up to get to his shoe. After all those hours on his feet, his knees were as stiff as a custom official's glare. With a burst of gold scales, Draco leaped out of his collar and landed on the narrow strip of floor beside the bed. May I help? He asked. Without waiting for an answer, he began unfastening Jack's shoes. Thanks, Jack said, letting his leg go flat again. It is the least I can do, Draco said, getting the first shoe off and setting it down on the floor. I have been of little aid to you so far. You certainly have, Jack assured him. If you hadn't gotten the comm clip out when you did. He shook his head. What do you mean? Uncle Verge asked suspiciously. What's been happening? The Brumgas treat their slaves like low-grade costume jewelry, Jack told him. If the slaves don't understand what they're saying, they treat them like punching bags. Uncle Verge muttered something nasty under his breath. Are you all right, lad? I'm fine, Jack assured him, wiggling his toes as Dracos got the other shoe off. It was really only the one Brumga at the dinner, and he was too drunk to really hit straight. Mostly I've just been run off my feet. And there has been no opportunity yet to locate the computers, Dracos added. But I am in the house, Jack pointed out. That's definitely progress. He yawned widely. I'd better get some sleep while I can, though. Her thumbleness will probably want me to brush her teeth for her when she wakes up. Uncle Verge sighed softly. All right, lad, he said. Pleasant dreams. Jack clicked off the comm clip and turned his head to look at Dracos. The dragon was pacing the floor, his back arched and uncomfortable looking. You coming aboard? He asked. I think I will remain out for a while, Dracos said. Jack frowned. Offhand, he couldn't remember ever seeing the dragon quite this twitchy. What's wrong? Dracos paused in his pacing. His long neck twisted toward Jack, then turned away. I am all right, he muttered. Sure you are, Jack said, studying him. Come on, what's the problem? Her thumbleness get into you or something? Reluctantly, he thought, Dracos came to a halt. It is not her, he said. It is this place. It is all of this place. His tongue slashed out in emphasis. I am sorry. Sorry for what? Jack asked. I don't like it much either. The dragon twisted his neck oddly. It is not a matter of liking or disliking, he said, his voice suddenly very quiet. For a Kada, this is an echo of a time long past. A terrible time. Jack sat up on the bed, his fatigue suddenly forgotten. Something in the dragon's tone had sent a shiver straight through him. Sounds serious, he said in his most soothing, tell me all about it voice. And was instantly ashamed of himself. Uncle Virgil had taught him that tone for wheedling information out of people they were trying to scam. He shouldn't be using it on a friend, especially not on a friend who could carve his initials into steel plate. I mean, do you want to talk about it? For a long moment, the dragon was silent. We were not always with the Shantine, he said at last. In the beginning, we were on another world, with another host race. Who? Jack asked. I mean, what were their names? We remember them as the Gidgrim, Dracos said. They were strong and cheerful, full of laughter and wisdom. We were both their symbionts and their friends. Sounds perfect, Jack said. It sounded too perfect, actually, but that was to be expected. Whatever nuggets of real history there might be in this story, they were almost certainly soaked in myth, sprinkled with legend, and served up with a side order of wishful thinking. Still, he was hardly in a position to point fingers. Uncle Virgil had never talked about Jack's own parents, and he had only vague memories of them himself. But that hadn't stopped him from spending hours wondering what they'd been like, or fantasizing about how his life would have been different if they hadn't died when he was 3. And in every one of those daydreams, his parents had come out taller and kinder and more handsome and more important than any human beings could actually be. Dracos and his half-mythical hosts were probably no different. So what went wrong? Dracos started pacing again. Our world was attacked by slavers, he said, his voice so low that Jack could hardly hear him. They came from the stars, with fire and death and supreme arrogance. The Kark, they called themselves. They came seeking lives to steal. They saw us and decided they wanted us. You fought back, of course, Jack murmured. With all the power and skill we possessed, Dracos said. But in the end, it was all for nothing. The slavers had strength beyond ours, and weapons far beyond those of the Degem. They captured many of us and our hosts, and then returned to the sky. The dragon paused again, his neck arched, his glowing green eyes staring off into the distance.
There are songs about our time of captivity,
he said.
One day, perhaps, I will sing one of them for you. For many years, many generations, we served the Kark as slaves. The Kada worked or fought for them or guarded their slave auctions. Their Degam hosts also did some work, but mostly they were held hostage for our good behavior.
Didn't they try to fight back? Jack asked.
Of course,
Draco said.
There are also many songs about those attempts. But in the end, all of them failed. The Kark were too strong and too cunning. Eventually, most of the Degem gave up and resigned themselves to their fate.
Let me guess, Jack said. The Kark decided they'd beaten you and started getting sloppy.
You are very perceptive,
Draco said.
But even with relaxed attention, the Kark were still watching them closely enough that a rebellion would never have succeeded.
He paused, staring through the wall again. Well? Jack prompted.
Something happened that had never happened before,
Draco said.
Something no one had ever thought could happen. Completely by accident, we discovered that a newly collected group of Kark slaves could serve as hosts.
The Shantine?
Exactly,
Draco said.
They were thought to be poor soldiers, so the Kark used them as menial slaves.
He flicked his tongue around again.
Much as you and I have now become for the Brumgas.
I get it, Jack said, nodding. Because they were just simple slaves, they gave you the advantage you needed.
What do you mean?
Dracos asked, turning his eyes on Jack. I mean, it's obvious, Jack said, suddenly feeling a little flustered. Even at the most relaxed of times, the dragon's stare was a little disconcerting. Slaves are treated like dirt or like animals, but you can turn that to your advantage. As long as the Shantine behave themselves, the Kark probably hardly even noticed them. Dracos was still staring, but the tip of his tail was tracing out slow circles.
Interesting,
he said.
I do not think I have ever thought of it quite that way.
Jack shrugged. It's the way I was brought up to think, he pointed out. No one expects a 7-year-old kid to be able to pull the stunts Uncle Virgil taught me. And you already said they didn't think the Shantine could fight.
True,
Draco said, still sounding thoughtful.
At any rate, the Shantine were eager to help. Together we made our plans and awaited our opportunity.
Where were the Degem in all this?
Those who had not yet given up hope of freedom were part of the planning,
Draco said.
The others, we could not risk their knowing.
Jack grimaced. Must have been tough for you.
We did what we had to do,
Draco said.
Our opportunity came some months later when the Kark landed on a new world to collect fresh slaves. The inhabitants fought back fiercely, and in the battles, some of the best Kada warriors began to slip away.
Faking their deaths, Jack said, nodding. And of course, since the Kark were keeping tabs on the Degem, they knew that even if the Kada had just run away, they'd be dead within a few hours anyway.
Correct,
Draco said.
Instead, the warriors slipped onto the bodies of the chosen Shantine, hiding beneath the long clothing they wore. And when the Kark finished their raid and lifted their ships into the sky, we struck.
He stopped, his back crest stiffened with memory.
It was a short battle,
he said, his voice quiet again.
We were all aboard one ship, with all our strength gathered, and had the advantage of surprise. But even so, we nearly lost the battle.
His tail lashed the air.
Someday I will sing you that song as well.
So now you had a ship, Jack said.
Yes,
Draco said.
but there was no way to return home. We did not know the location, and it had been too long for the ship's records to be of any use. We offered to return the Shantine to their world, but they were afraid other Kark ships could come looking for them, and us. So instead, we went in search of a new home where we could all live in peace and safety.
All three groups of you? Jack asked. Kada, Shantine, and Degam?
That was our hope.
Dracos murmured.
But for the Degem, sadly, the time of peace was all too short. Too many of them were lost in the final battle aboard the Kark ship, and there were no females left among them.
Jack winced. Oh.
Those who remained lived out their lives among us in peace and great honor.
Dracos went on.
But when they died, it was the end of their line.
Jack felt a tightness in his throat. So you and the Shantine made yourselves a home, he said, only to be driven away from it by the Valaga.
Yes,
Draco said.
Still, we had many centuries of peace there, and though we now have been forced to flee, we also found friends and allies during our stay. In balance, we have no cause to complain.
If you say so, Jack said. Of course, that's never stopped anyone else. Draco seemed to draw himself up.
Perhaps not,
he said firmly.
But a poet warrior of the Kada must hold himself to higher standards. We must learn from our past, but we must not allow our history to write itself over the present. Our task is to create the future.
Right, Jack said, deciding to take the dragon's word for whatever it was he had just said. Did all Kada warriors talk like that, he wondered, or was it just Dracos? So what part of the future did you want to create tonight?
We can only control that part immediately before us,
Dracos said.
And our first task to that end is to rest and gather our strength.
I was hoping you'd say that, Jack said, yawning. You going to sleep too, or haven't you finished pacing yet?
I have finished,
Dracos said. Stepping to Jack's side, he slipped up his sleeve.
Thank you for listening, and thank you too for your words of wisdom.
You're welcome, Jack told him, wondering what words of wisdom the dragon was talking about. Maybe later he would ask about it. For now, any further conversation would have to be in the form of sleep talking. Pleasant dreams, he said, and scooched himself down to lay flat on the bed again. Dracos might have said something back to him, but Jack was asleep long before he ever could have heard it.